Picture this, it's 1944, somewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe. Gunfire echoes through the streets. A young woman sits hunched over a typewriter in a cramped attic, her fingers flying across the keys. But she's not writing a novel or typing up reports. She's literally fighting a war. And that typewriter, it's about to become one of the most powerful weapons the Allies never saw coming. You know what's crazy? We always think of World War II battles being won with tanks, planes, and battleships. And sure, those helped. But sometimes the most devastating blow to an enemy doesn't come from a gun. It comes from something as simple as a typewriter and someone brave enough to use it. Today, I'm going to tell you about one of the most incredible untold stories from World War II. A story about a young resistance fighter whose weapon of choice wasn't a rifle or a grenade, it was a typewriter. And what she managed to pull off with that typewriter didn't just help win a battle. It changed the course of entire military operations and saved countless lives. This isn't your typical war hero story. There are no dramatic battlefield charges or dogfights in the sky. This is something different, something quieter but just as deadly. And honestly, once you hear what this girl managed to accomplish, you'll never look at a typewriter the same way again. So who was she? Well, her real name was kept secret for decades after the war ended. For her own safety and the safety of others who worked with her, she went by the codename Madeline. She was just 19 years old when this story takes place. 19. Most of us at that age are worrying about college exams or what to do on Friday night. She was literally running intelligence operations against the Nazi war machine. But here's the thing that makes this story even more remarkable. Madeline wasn't some trained spy who parachuted in from London. She wasn't a career military officer or a professional intelligence agent. She was just a regular girl who happened to have one particular skill that made her absolutely invaluable to the resistance movement. She could type fast, really, really fast. Now, I know what you're thinking. Big deal, right? Lots of people could type. But Madeline wasn't just fast. She was accurate under pressure. She could type in multiple languages, and most importantly, she understood something that a lot of people didn't understand back then. She understood that information moved wars, that knowing what your enemy was planning before they did it was worth more than 100 soldiers with rifles. The year was 1944, and the Nazis occupied most of Western Europe. The resistance movements in countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were doing everything they could to fight back. But here's the problem they faced. They had brave people willing to risk their lives. They had networks of supporters. What they didn't have was a way to quickly and accurately process the massive amounts of intelligence they were gathering. See, resistance fighters were constantly getting their hands on German documents, intercepted messages, stolen orders, overheard conversations, but all that information was useless if you couldn't organize it, analyze it, and get it to the right people fast enough to actually do something with it. That's where Madeline came in. She worked in a secret location, a safe house that changed every few weeks. Her job was to take all the raw intelligence that resistance fighters risked their lives to gather and turn it into actionable reports. She would type up summaries, cross-reference different pieces of information, and create documents that could be smuggled to Allied commanders. But the story I'm about to tell you goes way beyond just typing reports. Because in the spring of 1944, something happened that put Madeline and her typewriter right at the center of one of the most crucial moments of the war in that region. The resistance had gotten word that the Germans were planning a major operation. Something big. They had fragments of information, bits and pieces of overheard conversations, stolen paperwork, reports from sympathetic locals. But it was all scattered, incomplete, like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing, and no picture to guide you. And here's where things get intense. The resistance had maybe 72 hours to figure out what the Germans were planning and get that information to the Allied forces, who could actually do something about it. 72 hours to sort through dozens of reports, some in German, some in French, some handwritten and barely legible. 72 hours to potentially save hundreds or even thousands of lives. The resistance leaders knew they needed someone who could work fast, stay calm under pressure, and piece together information like a detective. They needed Madeline. And what she managed to do in those 3 days with nothing but a typewriter, a sharp mind, and nerves of absolute steel is the stuff legends are made of. So let me set the scene for you. It's April 1944. D-Day is still weeks away, but nobody in the resistance knows that. What they do know is that the Nazis are getting nervous. They're reinforcing positions, moving troops around, and planning operations to crush resistance networks before they can cause any trouble during what everyone suspects will be an Allied invasion. Madeline is working out of a small apartment in a town I couldn't name even today because it would reveal information about resistance networks that some governments still keep classified. Yeah, that's how serious this stuff was. The apartment belongs to an elderly couple who are part of the resistance. The husband is a retired school teacher, the wife a seamstress. To their neighbors, they're just a quiet old couple. Nobody suspects that, in their spare bedroom, intelligence work is happening that will affect actual military operations. The apartment has thick curtains that stay drawn all day. Madeline works by lamplight, even in the afternoon. The typewriter sits on a small desk pushed against the wall farthest from the windows. Next to it is a growing stack of papers, documents, notes, all waiting to be analyzed and typed up. The typewriter itself is a Remington portable, black and battered from constant use. Some of the keys stick. The E is slightly crooked, but it works, and that's all that matters. Here's what the resistance fighters had pieced together. The Germans were planning something called Operation Frühlingswind, spring wind, poetic name for something designed to kill resistance fighters, right? The Nazis were good at that, giving pretty names to ugly things. From what scattered intelligence they had, Operation Frühlingswind was going to be a coordinated sweep through multiple towns and villages, targeting suspected resistance safe houses, arresting anyone even remotely connected to resistance activities, and seizing weapons and supplies. The goal was to cripple the resistance network in that entire region. But here's what the resistance didn't know: exactly when it would happen, which specific locations would be targeted, and most critically, what German units would be involved. Without those details, they couldn't warn people, they couldn't evacuate safe houses, they couldn't move weapons caches, they couldn't prepare, so the resistance went into overdrive. Fighters, informants, and sympathizers all over the region started gathering every scrap of information they could find. A railway worker overheard German officers talking about troop movements. A French woman who cleaned German headquarters managed to glimpse documents on an officer's desk. A young man who delivered supplies to German barracks noted which units were being issued extra ammunition. All of these little pieces of intelligence started flowing to Madeline. Handwritten notes would arrive at the apartment, sometimes delivered by resistance fighters who risked their lives to get them there. Sometimes the notes came tucked into loaves of bread delivered by the baker. Sometimes they were sewn into the lining of coats. Once, a note arrived inside a dead fish at the market, which must have been a fun surprise. Madeline's job was to take all these fragments and turn them into a complete picture. And this is where her skills really came into play. Because she wasn't just typing, she was analyzing, cross-referencing, connecting dots that nobody else could see. She created a system on the left side of her desk. She kept documents organized by source. On the right side, documents organized by topic. In the middle, her typewriter, where she would create master documents pulling together related information. She worked 18, sometimes 20 hours a day during those 3 days, surviving on coffee and bread and sheer determination. Let me give you an example of how her mind worked. One report mentioned German trucks being loaded with supplies at midnight. Another report, from a completely different source, mentioned an officer complaining about needing to be somewhere before dawn. A third report noted increased fuel deliveries to a particular German garrison. Separately, these details meant nothing. But Madeline saw the connection. The midnight loading, plus the before dawn timeline, plus the increased fuel, meant those trucks were going somewhere close by. Somewhere they could reach before dawn. That helped narrow down the target locations. She did this over and over again, finding patterns, making connections, building a picture from fragments. Her fingers flew across those typewriter keys, hammering out report after report, summary after summary. The clicking of the typewriter became the soundtrack to those 3 days, a constant rhythm that the elderly couple could hear through the walls, even as they went about their daily routines to avoid suspicion. And here's something that makes this even more tense. Madeline knew the Germans were actively searching for resistance communication centers. They had radio detection equipment driving through towns, listening for radio transmissions. They had informants trying to infiltrate resistance networks. Every hour she worked was an hour she might be discovered. Now, here's where Madeline's work started revealing something that made everyone's blood run cold. As she pieced together the intelligence, she realized Operation Frühlingswind wasn't just a typical sweep. It was much bigger and much worse than anyone had thought. The Germans weren't just planning to raid a few safe houses, they were planning a massive, coordinated operation involving 3 different Wehrmacht units, Gestapo agents, and local collaborator police. We're talking hundreds of soldiers, dozens of vehicles, a whole military operation designed to essentially decapitate the entire resistance network in one swift blow. And the timing, it was scheduled to begin in less than 48 hours. From when Madeleine figured this out, 2 days, and potentially save the lives of dozens of resistance fighters and their families. But here's the problem. Even though Madeleine had figured out the big picture, she still didn't have all the specific details. She knew the operation was happening and roughly when, but the exact locations, still unclear. And without knowing which safe houses were on the German hit list, the resistance couldn't effectively warn everyone without potentially exposing safe houses that the Germans didn't even know about. It was a nightmare scenario. Warn to many people, and you might accidentally reveal locations to German informants who had infiltrated the networks. Warn to few people, and resistance fighters would walk right into German raids unprepared. So Madeleine did something brilliant. Instead of trying to nail down every specific detail, she started looking at patterns in German behavior from previous operations. She went back through months of typed reports, old intelligence summaries, anything that documented previous German raids and operations. And she found something. The Germans had a pattern. They typically started operations from specific garrison locations. They preferred certain routes because of road conditions and ease of movement. They had favorite times for raids, usually just before dawn when people were least alert. They tended to hit safe houses in a specific sequence, working from outer areas toward central locations to prevent people from fleeing inward. Using these patterns and the fragments of intelligence about Operation Frühlingswind, Madeleine started building a predictive map. She couldn't tell you with certainty every location that would be hit, but she could give you probabilities. This safe house had an 80% chance of being raided. That one, maybe 30%. This weapons cache, definitely a target. That communication point, probably safe for now. She typed all of this up in a detailed report, complete with maps she drew by hand showing German probable routes, timeline estimates, and recommendations for which locations to evacuate and which to leave alone to avoid suspicion. The report was 15 pages long. 15 pages that represented 3 days of barely sleeping, endless coffee, and mental work that would have broken most people. But typing the report was only half the battle. Now, it had to get to the right people. And this is where things got really dangerous, because the resistance leadership was scattered across the region. There was no single headquarters where Madeleine could send her report. It had to be copied multiple times and delivered to multiple locations. Remember, this is 1944. No photocopiers, no scanners, no email. If you wanted multiple copies of a document, you either had to retype it multiple times or use carbon paper. Carbon paper was risky because it was hard to find during wartime, and buying too much of it could attract suspicion. So Madeleine did what had to be done. She typed her 15-page report 6 times. 6 complete copies, each one typed from scratch because the carbon paper they had was old and barely worked. That's 90 pages of typing, all of which had to be perfect because these reports would be used to make life or death decisions. Her fingers were cramping. The E key on the typewriter was sticking worse than ever. The lamp was giving her a headache, but she kept typing. Click, dash click, dash click, dash click, dash click. The rhythm never stopped. The elderly couple who owned the apartment took turns standing watch, making sure no one suspicious was lurking around. The schoolteacher stood at the window, pretending to read a newspaper while actually watching the street. His wife sat in the kitchen doing needlework and listening for any unusual sounds. And in that back bedroom, Madeleine typed. She typed like lives depended on it, because lives did depend on it. Somewhere out there were resistance fighters who didn't know that in less than 2 days, German soldiers would be kicking down doors. There were families hiding Allied pilots who didn't know they were about to be arrested. There were weapons caches about to be discovered and communication networks about to be rolled up. Unless Madeleine could get her reports distributed in time. Unless her analysis was correct. Unless the resistance leaders trusted her intelligence enough to act on it. No pressure, right? When Madeleine finally finished typing the 6th copy of her report, her hands were shaking from exhaustion. But there was no time to rest, because now came perhaps the most dangerous part of the entire operation: getting those reports delivered. The resistance had couriers, brave men and women, who carried messages and documents between cells. But moving 6 copies of a 15-page intelligence report through Nazi-occupied territory wasn't like delivering a pizza. Every checkpoint was a risk. Every German patrol was a potential disaster. If even one of those couriers got caught with that report, the entire resistance network could be compromised. The reports had to be disguised. One copy was sewn into the lining of a courier's coat, the pages separated and distributed, so even if the coat was searched, it wouldn't be obvious what the papers were. Another copy was rolled up and hidden inside a hollowed-out baguette, because apparently the resistance really loved using bread for smuggling. A third copy was tucked inside a shipment of medical supplies heading to a hospital where a sympathetic doctor was part of the network. Each report went out with a different courier at different times, taking different routes to different locations. If the Germans intercepted one, they wouldn't get them all. It was smart, but it was also agonizing for Madeleine, because once those reports left her hands, she had no way of knowing if they'd reached their destinations. All she could do was wait, and waiting, as any soldier will tell you, is sometimes harder than fighting. So let's talk about what happened next, because this is where Madeleine's intelligence report either saved lives or was a complete waste of 3 days of work. The resistance leaders started receiving the reports about 30 hours before Operation Frühlingswind was scheduled to begin. 30 hours, not a lot of time, but enough. And here's what's amazing: they trusted Madeleine's analysis. They trusted it enough to bet lives on it. Based on her probability assessments, they started a carefully coordinated evacuation of higher-risk safe houses. Resistance fighters moved weapons caches from locations Madeleine had flagged as likely targets. Families hiding Allied airmen were quietly relocated in the middle of the night. But, and this is crucial, they didn't evacuate everything. Following Madeleine's advice, they left some of the lower probability locations active, maintaining just enough presence to make things seem normal to any German informants who might be watching. It was a calculated risk. If Madeleine's analysis was wrong, people would die. If she'd missed something, people would die. If her pattern recognition was off, if her timeline estimates were incorrect, if she'd misinterpreted any piece of the intelligence, people would die. No pressure for a 19-year-old girl with a typewriter, right? Operation Frühlingswind began exactly when Madeleine predicted it would. Just before dawn, 2 days after she'd finished her reports. German trucks rolled into towns across the region. Soldiers kicked down doors. The Gestapo conducted raids on suspected safe houses. And here's what they found: mostly empty rooms. Weapons caches that had been cleared out hours earlier. Safe houses that looked lived in but had no incriminating evidence. A few low-level resistance members who'd been designated to be captured to make the raids seem successful but who didn't actually know anything important. The Germans thought they'd dealt a serious blow to the resistance. They filed reports claiming success, stating they'd disrupted resistance operations and seized weapons. But in reality, Operation Frühlingswind was a massive failure. The resistance network survived largely intact because Madeleine's intelligence had allowed them to stay one step ahead. But it gets even better, and this is the part that really shows why Madeleine's work mattered so much. While the Germans were busy conducting their raids on locations, the resistance had already evacuated. The resistance was actually able to launch several counter-operations. Remember, Madeleine's report didn't just tell the resistance where the Germans would attack. It also told them where German forces wouldn't be, because they'd all be busy with Operation Frühlingswind. So while the Germans were kicking down doors in some towns, resistance fighters in other areas were blowing up railway lines, ambushing supply convoys, and sabotaging communications equipment. The Germans got so turned around that they actually blamed the failure of Operation Frühlingswind on the very chaos that the resistance was creating elsewhere. They thought they'd been deceived by bad intelligence, when in reality, they'd been completely outmaneuvered by a 19-year-old with a typewriter who could type faster and think clearer than their entire intelligence apparatus. And Madeleine, she was already back at that typewriter, processing the next batch of intelligence, connecting the next set of dots, typing up the next report that would help the resistance stay ahead of the Nazi war machine. Click, dash, click, dash, click, dash, click, dash, click. The typewriter never stopped. The war never stopped. And neither did she. Now, you might be wondering how we even know about this story. Because here's the thing about intelligence work during World War II. Most of it stayed secret for decades. The people involved couldn't talk about what they'd done. Governments kept files classified. Heroes went unrecognized because recognizing them would reveal methods and sources that might still be useful. Madeline's story only started coming to light in the 1970s, when researchers began getting access to declassified World War II documents. Even then, her real name was redacted. We still don't know her actual identity, though some historians have theories. What we do know comes from resistance memoirs, Allied intelligence reports, and German documents captured after the war. And as researchers dug deeper, they discovered something remarkable. The Operation Frühlingswind counterintelligence success wasn't a one-time thing for Madeline. It was just the most dramatic example of work she'd been doing for months. Throughout 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day and then pushed across France after the invasion, resistance networks were crucial for providing intelligence, conducting sabotage, and disrupting German operations. And in at least one region, Madeline and her typewriter were at the heart of how that resistance network functioned. She processed hundreds of intelligence reports. She created systems for organizing information that were actually studied after the war by intelligence agencies trying to understand how the resistance had been so effective. She trained other typists and analysts, passing on her methods for connecting fragmentary intelligence into useful operational pictures. But let's be real for a second. This wasn't some glamorous spy movie life. Madeline lived in constant fear. She moved safe houses every few weeks because staying in one place too long was suicidal. She couldn't tell her family what she was doing, assuming she even had family left alive by that point in the war. She couldn't have normal friendships or relationships because everyone she got close to became a potential security risk. The work itself was mentally exhausting. Imagine spending 18 hours a day reading reports about executions, arrests, torture, and war crimes, then having to stay calm enough to analyze that information and type up coherent reports. Imagine knowing that if you made a mistake, if you misread a piece of intelligence or connected the wrong dots, people would die because of your error, and the physical danger was constant. The apartment where she worked during Operation Frühlingswind was raided by the Germans 3 weeks later. Fortunately, Madeline had already moved to a new location, but the elderly couple who'd sheltered her were arrested. The school teacher was sent to a concentration camp, where he died. His wife survived the war, and in the 1970s, she gave an interview where she talked about the girl who'd worked in her spare bedroom, typing away day and night, the constant click-click-click of the typewriter. That interview is one of the few first-hand accounts we have of Madeline. The seamstress, who was in her 90s when she was interviewed, said she'd never forgotten that sound. The typewriter clicking away while outside, German patrols walked the streets. She said it was like listening to someone fight a war in slow motion, one keystroke at a time. Here's something else that makes Madeline's story significant. When we think about World War II heroism, we usually think about soldiers storming beaches, pilots in dogfights, tank commanders, resistance fighters with guns and explosives. All of that mattered, absolutely. But World War II was also the first truly modern war where information and intelligence were weapons as powerful as bombs and bullets. The Allies won World War II partly because they were better at gathering, processing, and using intelligence than the Axis powers were. Code breaking at Bletchley Park, photo reconnaissance, signal intelligence, resistance networks, feeding information to Allied commanders. All of that created an intelligence advantage that translated into military victories. And at the ground level, in occupied territories, that intelligence advantage often depended on people like Madeline. People who could take raw information and turn it into actionable intelligence. People who understood that a typewriter, used correctly, could save more lives than a machine gun. After the war ended, Madeline disappeared. Some historians think she emigrated to America or Britain. Others believe she returned to whatever normal life she could salvage after years of living in fear. A few researchers have claimed to have identified her, but without confirmation from intelligence archives that remain classified, we can't know for sure. What we do know is that her work mattered. The intelligence reports she typed up helped coordinate resistance activities that disrupted German operations. The counterintelligence she provided during Operation Frühlingswind and other German operations saved lives and kept resistance networks operational. Her methods for analyzing fragmentary intelligence influenced how Allied intelligence agencies operated. A girl with a typewriter changed the war, one keystroke at a time. And honestly, that might be one of the most powerful stories to come out of World War II. Let's zoom out for a minute and talk about why. Madeline's story matters beyond just being an incredible tale of courage. Because when you really look at what she accomplished, you're seeing something that would fundamentally change how wars were fought from that point forward. Before World War II, intelligence work existed, sure, but it was often disorganized, slow, and unreliable. Information took days or weeks to be processed and distributed. By the time intelligence reached the people who could act on it, the situation had often changed completely. But during World War II, both sides realized that speed of information could be as important as the information itself. The Germans understood this with their blitzkrieg tactics, moving so fast that enemy commanders couldn't react in time. The Allies understood this with their intelligence operations, trying to know what the enemy would do before the enemy even finalized their plans. And that's what makes Madeline's work so revolutionary. She wasn't just typing reports. She was essentially creating a real-time intelligence analysis system using nothing but paper, a typewriter, and her brain. In 3 days, she processed information that would have taken a traditional military intelligence unit weeks to analyze. She saw patterns that trained officers missed. She made connections that professional analysts didn't see. This is why, after the war, intelligence agencies studied how resistance networks had operated. They wanted to understand how these amateur organizations, working with minimal resources under constant threat of death, had sometimes been more effective at intelligence work than established military intelligence units with much bigger budgets and much better technology. What they found, when they studied cases like Madeline's, was that the secret wasn't fancy equipment or special training. It was having the right person in the right position with the right skills. Madeline could type fast, think clearly under pressure, see patterns in chaos, and stay calm when lives depended on her accuracy. Those skills, combined with the courage to use them in a war zone, made her as valuable as any commando unit. Now, let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in World War II histories: the role of women in resistance movements. The standard narrative focuses on male soldiers and male resistance fighters. And yes, men did a lot of the fighting. But resistance movements in occupied Europe absolutely depended on women for crucial roles. Women could move through occupied territories with less suspicion than men. A woman carrying a basket could be going to market. A man carrying a bag might be a resistance courier. Women worked as couriers, as safehouse operators, as intelligence gatherers, and yes, as analysts like Madeline. But here's what's frustrating. For decades after the war, these women's contributions were minimized or erased entirely. Memoirs written by male resistance leaders often barely mentioned the women who'd made their operations possible. Official histories focused on combat operations and overlooked intelligence work. Recognition and medals went primarily to men. It took decades of work by historians, particularly female historians, to recover these stories and give credit where it was due. And even now, we know there are countless stories of women's resistance work that are lost forever because the women involved never spoke up, never wrote memoirs, never sought recognition. Madeline is one of the lucky ones, if you can call it luck. Her story survived because enough people who worked with her mentioned her in their accounts, because documents existed that referenced her reports, because she was so good at what she did that even decades later, people remembered that someone had been doing remarkable intelligence work in that region. But how many other Madelines were there? How many other women with typewriters or radios or just sharp minds and courage were doing similar work that never got documented? We'll never know, and that's tragic. Here's another thing worth considering. Madeline was 19 years old when this happened. 19. That's younger than most college students today. She was doing work that would have challenged professional intelligence analysts with years of training and experience. And she was doing it while living under Nazi occupation, knowing that discovery meant torture and death. Think about what you were doing at 19, what kind of pressure you could handle, what kind of work you were capable of. Now imagine doing intelligence analysis that determined whether people lived or died, all while Nazis literally patrolled the streets outside. The mental fortitude that required is almost impossible to comprehend. The stress would have destroyed most people. The fear alone would have been paralyzing. But Madeline, and women like her throughout occupied Europe, found the strength to keep working, keep fighting, keep resisting, even when every day could have been their last. And they did it without the things we take for granted now. No therapy to process trauma, no support systems, no recognition or praise that might have made the work feel worthwhile. Just the knowledge that what they were doing mattered, and the hope that somehow, someday, the war would end and they might survive to see it. Let's get into some of the technical aspects of what Madeline was actually doing, because I think understanding the specific skills involved makes her achievement even more impressive. First, there's the typing itself. Now, you might think typing is typing, right? But there's a huge difference between typing up a letter to your friend and doing the kind of work Madeline was doing. She was working with documents in multiple languages, often with handwriting that was barely legible, sometimes with coffee stains or water damage, occasionally with blood on them because they'd been smuggled out of dangerous situations. She had to be able to read German well enough to accurately transcribe German documents. She had to understand French and likely Dutch or Flemish, depending on exactly where she was operating. She had to be able to decipher different handwriting styles, understand military terminology in multiple languages, and catch potential errors or inconsistencies in the intelligence she was processing. And she had to do all of this while typing fast enough to process the massive volume of information flowing through the resistance network. We're talking probably 60, 70, maybe 80 words per minute, sustained over hours, with accuracy rates that had to be near perfect because a single typo could change the meaning of crucial intelligence. Then there's the analytical work. This is where Madeline really distinguished herself from just being a skilled typist. Anyone can type fast. Not everyone can look at fragmentary intelligence and build a coherent picture from it. She was essentially doing work that today would be done by sophisticated computer algorithms and entire teams of professional intelligence analysts. She was pattern recognition software running on a human brain. She was a database that could cross-reference information, identify connections, and spot inconsistencies without any of the tools modern analysts take for granted. Think about how she pieced together the Operation Frühlingswind intelligence. She had dozens of separate reports from different sources. Some reliable, some questionable, some detailed, some vague, some in German, some in French, some were eyewitness accounts, some were rumors, some were intercepted documents. She had to evaluate each piece of information for reliability. Who was the source? Had they been reliable before? Did their information match with other reports or contradict them? If it contradicted other reports, which one was more likely to be accurate? She had to organize information by relevance and category. What's useful for understanding the big picture? What's tactical detail that matters for specific operations? What's background noise that seems important but actually isn't? She had to identify patterns across different reports. If 3 different sources mention increased German activity in a specific area, that's not a coincidence. If reports mention the same German officer in multiple locations, that tells you something about command structures. If multiple sources talk about supply movements, you can infer where those supplies are going and what they might be used for. And she had to do all of this while under incredible time pressure. Intelligence is perishable. Information that's a week old is often useless. She had to work fast enough that her analysis could actually be acted upon while it still mattered. Now, add in the fact that she was teaching herself these skills on the job. It's not like the Resistance had training programs for intelligence analysts. She was figuring out methodologies through trial and error, learning what worked and what didn't, developing her own systems for organizing and processing information. The Resistance leaders recognized her talent and increasingly relied on her analysis. They'd bring her intelligence and basically ask, "What does this mean?" And she'd have to give them answers they could use to make operational decisions. That's an enormous amount of responsibility for anyone, let alone a teenager. And the consequences of getting it wrong weren't just embarrassment or a bad grade, they were people dying. Let me give you another example of her work, beyond Operation Frühlingswind. About a month later, the Resistance started receiving reports about a new German unit moving into the region. They had bits and pieces. Someone saw trucks. Someone else heard soldiers speaking with a specific dialect. A third source reported specific types of equipment. Madeline took all these fragments and concluded that this wasn't a combat unit. It was a logistics unit, which meant they were establishing supply depots for frontline troops. That was valuable intelligence because supply depots are soft targets. They're not heavily defended like military bases, but destroying them can have huge impacts on enemy operations. Based on her analysis, The resistance was able to identify where the supply depots were being established and coordinate attacks with Allied bombers. Those supply depots getting destroyed meant German troops on the front lines didn't get ammunition, food, and fuel they needed. One intelligence analyst with a typewriter had just impacted actual military operations. That's the kind of thing that wins wars. And it happened because Madeleine could look at fragmentary information and see what it really meant, then type up a clear, actionable report that commanders could actually use. Every click of that typewriter was changing the war, one keystroke at a time. So what can we learn from Madeleine's story? Because I think there are some powerful lessons here that go way beyond just history. First, there's the obvious lesson about courage. Madeleine chose to fight, even though she could have tried to keep her head down and survive the war quietly. She risked her life every single day because she believed that resisting tyranny mattered more than personal safety. That's heroism in its purest form. But there's also a subtler lesson about how you fight. Madeleine didn't pick up a rifle. She didn't plant bombs. She fought with the skills she had: typing, analysis, organization, pattern recognition. She turned ordinary skills into weapons by using them in extraordinary circumstances. How many of us assume that making a difference requires some special talent we don't have? We think we can't change the world because we're not soldiers or politicians or geniuses. But Madeleine changed the war because she could type and think clearly under pressure. Those are skills lots of people have. The difference was that she used them. There's also something here about the value of information. We live in the information age, but I'm not sure we always appreciate how powerful information really is. Madeleine understood that knowing what your enemy would do before they did it was worth more than weapons. That intelligence, properly processed and distributed, could save lives and win battles. In our world, we're drowning in information, but often starving for actual understanding. We have access to unlimited data, but struggle to make sense of it. Madeleine's story reminds us that having information isn't enough. You need someone who can process it, analyze it, and turn it into something useful. And then there's the lesson about invisible heroes. How many people who've changed history never got recognized for it? How many crucial contributions happened behind the scenes, done by people whose names we'll never know? Madeleine's story almost disappeared entirely. If not for a few historians digging through archives and tracking down aging resistance members willing to talk, we'd never know what she accomplished. That makes you wonder, what other stories are lost? What other incredible acts of courage and brilliance happened during World War II? Or any war, or any historical moment that nobody documented? How many heroes died, unknown and unrecognized? It's humbling, and it should make us appreciate that history isn't just about the famous generals and politicians whose names fill the textbooks. History is also made by 19-year-old girls with typewriters working in secret apartments, risking everything to fight tyranny with the only weapons they had: their minds and their courage. Now, I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier. We still don't know Madeleine's real name, and honestly, maybe that's fitting, because her story isn't really about one person. It's about all the people, mostly women, who did this kind of work during the war. The typists and couriers and safehouse operators and intelligence gatherers, whose names we don't know, but whose work mattered just as much as any soldiers. When you visit World War II memorials, you see names carved in stone. Soldiers who died in battle, pilots who didn't return, sailors who went down with their ships, and they deserve to be remembered. Absolutely. But there should also be memorials to the people like Madeleine, the intelligence analysts and resistance members and ordinary civilians who became extraordinary heroes in ways that don't make for dramatic battlefield monuments. Maybe the fact that we don't know Madeleine's name makes her story even more powerful. She represents all of them. Every time someone looks at a typewriter and thinks it's just an obsolete piece of office equipment, they should remember that once, typewriters were weapons that helped win a war. Every time someone thinks their skills aren't special enough to make a difference, they should remember a 19-year-old who changed the course of battles because she could type fast and think clearly. Every time someone wonders if individual actions matter in the face of huge historical forces, they should remember that one person processing intelligence in a secret apartment saved lives and helped defeat Nazi Germany. That's not just history, that's inspiration. That's proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the courage to try. That's evidence that you don't need to be a superhero to be a hero. You just need to use what you have, whatever skills and talents you possess, to fight for what's right. Madeline did that. Countless other resistance members did that. They fought tyranny with typewriters and bicycles and printing presses, and whispered, conversations, and sheer stubborn courage. They won not because they were stronger than the Nazis, but because they were smarter, braver, and more determined to resist evil no matter the cost. So the next time you see an old typewriter in an antique shop or a museum, think about Madeline. Think about what that machine represented during World War II. Think about the click-click-click of keys that echoed through secret apartments while Nazi patrols walked the streets outside. Think about intelligence reports typed with shaking hands that saved lives and changed battles. And remember that heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they storm beaches, sometimes they fly missions, and sometimes they sit at typewriters and fight wars one keystroke at a time. All of them matter. All of them changed history. All of them deserve to be remembered. Madeline, whoever you were, wherever you ended up after the war, thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your intelligence. Thank you for showing us that an ordinary skill used with extraordinary bravery can change the world. Your name might be lost to history, but your story lives on. And that story reminds us that each of us has the power to make a difference if we just have the courage to try. The typewriter is silent now. The war ended decades ago, but the lesson remains. Never underestimate what one person with courage and determination can accomplish. Never assume your skills aren't valuable enough to matter. And never forget that the greatest heroes are often the ones whose names we never learn, whose stories almost disappeared, but whose actions changed everything. That's the story of the girl who used a typewriter to win a battle. That's the story of Madeline. That's the story of countless heroes whose names we'll never know, but whose courage we should never forget. And if that doesn't inspire you to use whatever skills and talents you have to make the world better, I don't know what will. Because if a 19-year-old with a typewriter could help defeat Nazi Germany, imagine what you could do with what you have right now. Click dash click dash click dash click dash click. The sound of a typewriter, the sound of resistance, the sound of one person changing history. May we all find our own typewriters, our own ways to fight for what's right. May we all have even a fraction of Madeline's courage. And may we never forget that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to give up. That's the power of one person. That's the power of intelligence over violence. That's the power of a typewriter in the hands of a hero. Never forget it.